The quickest way to disappear in a royal palace was to make yourself useful. Lyra learned that lesson when she was 13 years old, standing on a wooden crate beside a stove twice her size, while cooks shouted orders over the roar of the kitchen fires. 7 years later, she had become nearly invisible. Every morning before sunrise, while the silver towers of Silverfong Palace still slept beneath a blanket of mist, Lyra crossed the stone courtyard carrying baskets of rosemary, thyme, cinnamon sticks, and dried citrus peels. The guards rarely looked at her. The servants barely noticed her. Even the head chef sometimes forgot she was in the room. And that was exactly how she wanted it. The palace kitchen stretched across nearly half an acre beneath the western wing, filled with copper pots, long wooden tables, and the comforting scent of fresh bread. To most people, it smelled like dinner. To Lyra, it smelled like safety. She moved quietly between rows of ingredients, her dark hair tied beneath a simple scarf as she measured spices with practiced hands. A pinch of cinnamon, a touch of nutmeg, a spoonful of crushed cloves. The mixture disappeared into a simmering stock pot, carrying with it something no one else knew she was hiding: her scent. In a kingdom where wolves could identify one another by smell alone, Lyra had spent years masking her omega nature beneath herbs and spices. The blend wasn't magic. It was patience, knowledge, discipline. Every day, she layered fragrances carefully until all traces of herself disappeared beneath warm notes of baking bread and garden herbs. Most people assumed she smelled like the kitchen because she worked there. No one questioned it. No one looked closer. Outside the palace walls, the entire kingdom buzzed with rumors. The Alpha King had announced he would soon choose a Luna. Noble families traveled hundreds of miles to attend upcoming banquets. Wealthy merchants purchased expensive gowns for their daughters. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same topic: who would become queen? Lyra heard the gossip constantly. While kneading dough, while chopping vegetables, while carrying trays through servant corridors. She listened politely and returned to work. Queens belonged to stories. She belonged to the kitchen. Yet even she couldn't completely avoid hearing about the Alpha King himself. Some called him brilliant. Others called him distant. The one thing everyone agreed on was that he had become harder to read with every passing year. He attended meetings, signed decrees, protected the kingdom. But smiles had become rare. Laughter even rarer. Some servants whispered that he seemed lonely despite possessing everything a king could desire. Lyra never repeated gossip. She simply stirred her soups and focused on her recipes. That evening, preparations for a royal banquet filled every corner of the kitchen with frantic energy. Dozens of dishes lined the counters beneath golden lantern light. Roasted vegetables, fresh bread, honey-glazed fruit, steaming soups. The head chef paced nervously while servers hurried in and out carrying silver trays. Lyra remained near the back, finishing a final pot of vegetable soup using a recipe her grandmother had taught her years ago. Nothing extravagant, just simple ingredients prepared with care. She tasted it once, nodded softly, and handed the pot to a waiting servant. Minutes later, the banquet began. Music echoed faintly through the palace halls. Conversations drifted from the grand dining chamber. The kitchen staff returned to cleaning stations and preparing desserts. Then suddenly, the doors burst open. A young server hurried inside, breathing hard. The entire room froze. "The king," the servant whispered. The king stopped eating. Silence swept across the kitchen. The head chef's face drained of color. "What happened?" he demanded. The servant swallowed. He tasted the soup. Every cook exchanged nervous looks. The head chef grabbed the edge of a table. And the young servant stared toward the back of the room where Lyra stood holding a wooden spoon. "And he wants to know who made it." The kitchen remained silent long after the young servant delivered the message. No one moved. No one breathed. The head chef stared across the room as though he had forgotten how to speak. Then his eyes landed on Lyra. "You made the soup?" he asked. Lyra nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the wooden spoon in her hand. Around her, dozens of cooks exchanged nervous glances. One woman quietly crossed herself. Another whispered that perhaps the seasoning had been wrong. Lyra felt her stomach sink. She replayed every step of the recipe in her mind. The vegetables had been fresh. The broth had simmered for exactly 3 hours. The herbs were balanced. Nothing had gone wrong. At least, she did not think so. "Come with me," the servant said. The words landed like a stone in still water. Lyra swallowed hard. She removed her apron, smoothed the wrinkles from her plain gray dress, and followed the servant through a maze of palace corridors. The farther they walked, the quieter the palace became. The sounds of clattering dishes and kitchen chatter faded behind them until only the soft echo of footsteps remained. Golden chandeliers glowed overhead. Moonlight spilled through tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. Every step seemed to make her more aware of her heartbeat. By the time they reached the grand dining hall, she could feel it in her throat. The enormous doors opened. Hundreds of candles illuminated the room. Noble families filled long tables dressed in velvet and silver. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the light. Conversations that had once filled the hall now faded into silence as every eye turned toward the kitchen servant standing in the doorway. Lyra immediately lowered her gaze. She could feel curiosity washing over the room. Some guests looked confused. Others looked disappointed. This was not a noblewoman, not a future Luna, not someone worth noticing. She was simply a cook. At the far end of the hall sat the Alpha King. He appeared younger than the story suggested, strong without appearing boastful, calm without seeming cold. Yet there was something distant in his silver eyes, as though part of him stood somewhere far beyond the palace walls. A half-finished bowl of soup rested before him. "Come forward," he said. His voice was quiet. He did not need to raise it. The room listened anyway. Lyra approached carefully and stopped several feet away from the royal table. She kept her head bowed. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lyra, Your Majesty." The king studied her for a moment. Not her clothes, not her appearance. Her. It was the kind of attention that made her feel strangely exposed. "How long have you worked in the palace?" 7 years, Your Majesty." "And this recipe?" His gaze shifted briefly toward the bowl. "Is it yours?" "It belonged to my grandmother." Something changed in his expression. Not much, just enough for Lyra to notice. "I see." Silence followed. Several nobles exchanged confused looks. The king had summoned an entire servant before the royal court only to discuss soup. Then he lifted another spoonful and tasted it again. This time his eyes briefly closed. The hall became so quiet that Lyra could hear the crackling of candle flames. "It tastes like home," he said softly. The word seemed intended for no one in particular. A strange warmth spread through the room. Lyra blinked in surprise. She had expected criticism, questions, perhaps punishment. Not this. The king opened his eyes and looked directly at her. For the first time in years, something almost resembling peace appeared in his face. "Thank you, Lyra." No one in the hall could remember the last time the Alpha King had thanked anyone publicly. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Lyra felt every stare in the room shift toward her. She wanted nothing more than to disappear back into the safety of her kitchen. Instead, the king spoke again. "From this evening forward, I want all of my evening meals prepared by her." The hall fell silent once more. Lyra's breath caught. The head chef nearly dropped the tray he was carrying. And somewhere among the gathered nobles, more than one ambitious family suddenly began paying very close attention to an invisible Omega cook. The palace changed after that night, although no one spoke of it openly. Lyra noticed it first in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. Servants who had never looked at her before suddenly smiled too quickly. Junior cooks offered to carry her baskets. Even the head chef seemed uncertain whether to scold her or thank her. None of it felt comfortable. Attention had weight, and she had spent years learning how to avoid it. Now it followed her through every corridor like a shadow. The king's evening meals became part of her daily routine. Every afternoon, she selected ingredients herself from the palace gardens and storage rooms. Fresh carrots, sweet onions, garden herbs, apples from the eastern orchards. Nothing extravagant. She understood something many palace chefs forgot. People remembered how food made them feel long after they forgot what was on the plate. So she cooked for comfort, for warmth, for the feeling of coming home after a long winter day. Each evening, a royal servant collected the meal and carried it to the king's private dining room. Lyra never expected to see him again. Yet 3 days after the banquet, she was arranging jars of dried herbs when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Why cinnamon?" The knife nearly slipped from her fingers. She turned and found the Alpha King standing at the end of the preparation table. No guards, no advisors, no royal announcement. Just the king observing a collection of spices as though they contained the answers to great mysteries. Lyra quickly lowered her eyes. Your Majesty. Why cinnamon? He repeated. She hesitated. Because it reminds people of happy memories. Silence followed. Then she heard the faint scrape of a chair being pulled closer. How? He asked. Lyra blinked. No one had ever asked her that before. Most people connect smells to moments they love, she said carefully. A holiday. A family meal. A warm kitchen. Sometimes they do not even realize it. The king looked at the small glass jar in her hands. Interesting. That should have ended the conversation. Instead, he stayed. He asked about rosemary. About apples. About why she preferred fresh thyme over dried. The questions were simple, but the way he listened felt unusual. Most nobles listened only long enough to speak. The king listened as though every answer mattered. Over the next week, he returned several times. Never for long. Sometimes only a few minutes. Yet each visit left Lyra more confused. This was not the distant ruler described in court gossip. This man seemed tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone carrying responsibilities too heavy to share. One rainy evening, she watched him stare through a kitchen window while thunder rolled across the dark hills beyond the palace. For a moment, he looked less like a king and more like a lonely man searching for something he could not name. Then it happened. As Lyra reached for another handful of herbs, the king suddenly grew still. His silver eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger. In concentration. A strange tension settled into the room. Lyra felt her pulse quicken. For years, her blend of spices had hidden every trace of her natural scent. Every morning, every evening, every hour. She never forgot. Yet today had been different. The kitchen was hotter than usual. Steam filled the air. She had been distracted. The king took one slow breath. Then another. Something flickered across his expression. Recognition. Curiosity. Surprise. Lyra's heart dropped. Beneath the familiar aromas of cinnamon, rosemary, and baked apples, something else had escaped into the air. Something she had spent 7 years hiding. Lyra's fingers tightened around the small jar of rosemary as the silence stretched between them. The kitchen suddenly felt too warm. Too bright. Too small. The king did not move. He simply stood there watching her with an expression she could not read. Then, to her surprise, he looked away. Whatever he had noticed, he chose not to mention it. Relief washed through her so quickly that her knees nearly weakened. The rain is getting stronger, he said quietly, his attention returning to the storm beyond the window. Moments later he left, and Lyra released a breath she had not realized she was holding. That night, she doubled the amount of herbs in her scent blend. The next morning she added even more. If there had been a mistake, she would not make it again. Unfortunately, fate rarely listened to careful plans. 3 days later, Silverfong Palace hosted its largest banquet of the season. Noble families arrived from every corner of the kingdom. Expensive gowns swept across polished floors. Jewel-covered necklaces reflected the light of hundreds of candles. Musicians filled the grand hall with elegant melodies while servants carried endless trays of food between tables. Lyra remained exactly where she preferred to be, hidden behind kitchen doors. Invisible. Useful. Safe. At least until one of the noble women wandered into the service corridor. Lady Vivian Ashcroft was known throughout the kingdom for her beauty, confidence, and talent for attracting attention. She had spent the entire evening trying to impress the Alpha King. Unfortunately, the king had barely looked in her direction. Irritated and searching for someone to blame, she noticed the palace staff gathering around a preparation table. At the center stood Lyra. "So this is the famous cook," Vivian said with a smile that never reached her eyes. Several servants immediately stepped back. Lyra lowered her gaze. "Good evening, my lady." Vivian's eyes swept over her simple dress. "Interesting. I expected someone more impressive." A few nearby nobles laughed politely. Lyra remained silent. Years of experience had taught her that silence often ended uncomfortable conversations faster than arguments. But Vivian was not interested in ending anything. Her gaze narrowed slightly. "There is something familiar about you." The corridor grew quieter. Then the noblewoman stepped closer and inhaled. Just once. A small smile appeared. "Ah," she said softly. "Now I understand." Lyra felt cold. Vivian turned toward the gathering crowd. "Did everyone know the king's favorite cook is an Omega?" The words spread through the corridor faster than wildfire through dry grass. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Whispers immediately followed. Some sounded surprised. Others sounded amused. Within minutes, the rumor reached the banquet hall itself. Lyra wished the stone floor would simply open beneath her feet. She tried to leave, but a servant carrying a tray brushed against her shoulder. Several small bowls tipped forward, spilling bright red berry sauce across the front of her apron. Gasps filled the corridor. Then came laughter. Not cruel laughter from everyone, but enough. Enough to make her cheeks burn. Enough to remind her why she had spent years hiding. Lyra stared down at the stains spreading across the fabric. She told herself to remain calm, to clean it up, to disappear quietly. Then a familiar voice echoed through the hall behind her. Calm. Cold. Impossible to ignore. Who gave permission, the Alpha King asked, for my cook to be treated this way? The corridor fell completely silent. Even the musicians in the distant banquet hall seemed to fade into the background. Lyra did not look up immediately. She could feel every eye turning toward the Alpha King. The nobles parted without being asked. Servants stepped aside. The atmosphere itself seemed to shift as he approached. Slow footsteps echoed across the polished floor. When Lyra finally lifted her gaze, she saw him standing only a few feet away. His attention moved briefly to the stain covering the front of her apron. Then his eyes traveled across the crowd. No one hurried to explain. No one volunteered a defense. A moment earlier, they had all been eager to laugh. Now they appeared fascinated by the floor. Lady Vivian recovered first. Her smile returned, though it seemed less certain than before. Your Majesty, it was only a small accident. The king regarded her calmly. I was not speaking to you. The words were not loud. Somehow they felt heavier than a shout. Vivian immediately fell silent. Lyra wished she could disappear. The attention pressing against her from every direction felt unbearable. She had spent years building a life that required no notice, no recognition, no expectations. Yet somehow she stood at the center of the entire palace. The king reached toward a nearby serving table. A servant quickly handed him a folded white linen cloth. To everyone's astonishment, he stepped forward and offered it to Lyra. For a moment, she simply stared. You should not spend your evening worrying about a stained apron, he said. His voice softened slightly. You have more important things to do. Lyra accepted the cloth with trembling fingers. Thank you, Your Majesty. Around them, shocked whispers spread through the corridor. Noble guests stared openly. Several servants looked as though they might faint. No one could remember the Alpha King ever showing such public consideration toward a member of the palace staff. The king turned toward the gathering crowd. His expression remained calm, but something firm settled into his silver eyes. A person who helps feed this kingdom deserves respect. Silence answered him. Titles matter, he continued. Position matters. Tradition matters. But kindness matters more. No one challenged him. No one dared. Lyra noticed several nobles lowering their eyes. Even those who had laughed moments earlier suddenly seemed very interested in their own shoes. The tension slowly dissolved. Conversations resumed in cautious whispers. Guests drifted back toward the banquet hall. Yet something fundamental had changed. The invisible line separating Lyra from everyone else no longer existed in quite the same way. For better or worse, people now saw her. Later that night, after the banquet finally ended, Lyra returned to the kitchen alone. The enormous room sat quiet beneath rows of dim lanterns. Most of the staff had already gone home. She washed dishes, organized ingredients, and tried to convince herself the evening had never happened. But the memory lingered. The king's words. The way he had stepped forward when no one else had. The strange warmth she felt whenever she remembered the look in his eyes. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows. Lyra moved toward the herb shelves and reached for the mixture she used every day. Yet as she opened the small container, she noticed something unsettling. The familiar blend looked nearly empty. There was only enough remaining for another day or two, and the rare mountain herbs required to create more could not be purchased anywhere near Silverfong Palace. Rain covered Silverfong Palace for 3 straight days. Gray clouds hung low above the towers while cold water streamed down stone walls and filled the gardens with the scent of wet earth. Lyra spent those days searching every storage room she could access. Every cabinet, every shelf, every forgotten crate tucked into dark corners of the palace. But the mountain herbs she needed were gone. The final handful disappeared on the 4th morning. She stood alone before the preparation table, staring at the empty container. For 7 years that blend had protected her. For 7 years it had allowed her to live quietly. Now it was gone. She tried to convince herself that perhaps it would not matter. Perhaps no one would notice. Yet deep inside she knew better. Wolves noticed everything, especially kings. That evening she prepared dinner as usual. Roasted vegetables, fresh bread, herb soup, simple food, comforting food. Her hands moved through familiar motions, but her thoughts refused to settle. Outside, thunder rolled across distant hills. Steam rose from simmering pots and drifted through the kitchen in soft clouds. The air felt warmer than usual, heavier. By the time the royal servant arrived to collect the meal, Lyra's pulse was already racing. Half an hour later, another messenger appeared. His Majesty requests your presence. The words immediately tightened every muscle in her body. She followed the servant through quiet corridors until they reached a private dining room overlooking the eastern gardens. Unlike the grand banquet hall, this room felt peaceful. A single fireplace glowed softly. Rain tapped against tall windows. The Alpha King sat alone at a long wooden table. Most of his meal had already disappeared. Lyra, he said, please sit. She hesitated. No servant sat with the king. Yet something in his expression made refusal impossible. Carefully, she lowered herself into the chair across from him. For a moment neither spoke. The fire crackled softly between them. Then the king took a slow breath. Another. His silver eyes lifted toward hers. Something is different. Lyra's heart stumbled. Your Majesty? He looked toward the rain-covered window. For weeks I thought the kitchen itself carried a certain scent. His voice remained calm, thoughtful. Cinnamon, bread, herbs, warmth. Lyra remained silent. But now I realized those things were only part of it. Fear twisted inside her chest. Not fear of punishment. Fear of being seen. Truly seen. The king leaned back slightly. Do you know what I smell when you walk into a room? She could not answer. He smiled faintly. Not the smile of a ruler addressing a servant. The smile of a man remembering something precious. Fresh bread cooling on a kitchen windowsill. Apples baked during the first snowfall. Cinnamon drifting through a small house filled with laughter. His gaze softened. It reminds me of my mother. Lyra blinked. Surprise replaced fear. The king looked away toward the storm beyond the glass. Before I became king, before responsibility swallowed every hour of my life, there was a place that felt safe. His voice grew quieter. I have not remembered that feeling in years. The room fell silent again. Rain continued falling outside. The fire continued glowing. Something warm spread through Lyra's chest. Not because he had discovered her secret, because for the first time she understood what he had been searching for all along. Not power, not status, not another noble family competing for attention. Home. And somehow, without realizing it, she had reminded him what home felt like. Then a sharp knock echoed against the door. A royal attendant entered carrying an urgent letter. The king's expression changed as he read it. Not angry, concerned. He looked up slowly. It seems, he said, that Lord Harrington has requested permission to remove you from palace service and employ you exclusively at his estate. The warmth vanished from Lyra's chest. Every noble in the kingdom had noticed her, and now one of them intended to take her away. The news spread through the palace before sunrise. By breakfast, every servant knew. By lunch, every noble visiting Silverfong had heard some version of the story. Lord Harrington wanted Lyra transferred to his estate. Officially, he claimed her culinary skills deserved greater recognition. Unofficially, everyone understood the truth. People wanted access to whatever had captured the king's attention. Lyra tried to ignore the rumors. She buried herself in work, chopping vegetables, kneading dough, and organizing supplies. Yet everywhere she turned, conversations stopped. Curious eyes followed her movements. For the first time in her life, invisibility was impossible. 3 days later, a formal invitation arrived. Lord Harrington requested her presence at a gathering hosted on the edge of the capital. The letter described it as a celebration of culinary excellence. The palace staff described it differently. A test, an audition, a chance for wealthy families to decide who might benefit from bringing the king's favorite cook into their circle. Lyra wanted to refuse. Unfortunately, servants rarely rejected noble invitations. So she went. The estate stood on rolling hills less than 10 miles from Silverfong Palace. Elegant gardens surrounded a sprawling manor filled with guests. Crystal lanterns glowed beneath the evening sky, while musicians played soft melodies from a nearby terrace. Everything looked beautiful. Yet the moment Lyra arrived, something felt wrong. Too many smiles. Too many questions. Too much interest. Noble guests approached one after another. Some asked about recipes. Others asked about palace life. A few seemed fascinated by her omega status. Each conversation left her more uncomfortable than the last. Hours passed. The gathering grew louder. Then Lord Harrington finally approached. He was charming, well-dressed, and impossible to avoid. "You seem unhappy," he observed. "I am simply not accustomed to this much attention." He laughed. "You should become accustomed to it." His gaze swept across the crowd. "A talented woman deserves opportunities." Lyra forced a polite smile. Deep down she knew this had never been about opportunities. It was about ownership, influence, status. She excused herself and slipped outside into the gardens. Cool evening air greeted her. For the first time all night, she could breathe. The moon hung above rows of silver roses while distant music drifted through open windows. Peace lasted less than a minute. Footsteps sounded behind her. Then another set. Then another. Several guests emerged into the garden. Eager to continue conversations, she desperately wanted to escape. Lyra turned down a stone path, hoping to find privacy. Instead, she found herself deeper inside the estate grounds than intended. The manor lights seemed farther away. The music quieter. Anxiety tightened inside her chest. Then a familiar voice shattered the silence. "There you are." Lyra stopped. At the far end of the path stood the Alpha King. Moonlight silvered his dark coat, while the evening breeze stirred his hair. Relief washed through her so suddenly that it almost hurt. The king crossed the garden toward her. Behind him, every noble guest immediately froze. No one understood why the ruler of the kingdom had personally arrived at a private gathering. The king ignored them completely. His attention never left Lyra. And for the first time since leaving the palace, she no longer felt alone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The garden seemed to hold its breath along with everyone else. Moonlight spilled across the stone path, painting silver highlights across the roses and the distant fountains. Lyra looked at the Alpha King and saw none of the authority that usually surrounded him. No throne, no royal court, no advisors, just a man who had crossed half the capital to find her. "Your Majesty," she whispered. Something softened in his expression when he heard her voice. "I have been looking for you." Behind them, Lord Harrington finally stepped forward. "Your Majesty, what an unexpected honor." The king glanced toward him briefly. "Indeed." The single word ended the conversation before it began. Lord Harrington wisely retreated. The other guests followed his example. Within minutes, the garden path belonged only to Lyra and the king. A cool breeze stirred the roses. Somewhere in the distance, music continued drifting from the manor ballroom. Yet it felt very far away. "You should not have come here," Lyra said quietly. "Why?" the king asked. "Because you are the king." To her surprise, he smiled. That answer becomes less convincing every time someone gives it. Lyra looked down at her hands. She did not know what to say. Nothing about the evening made sense. Nothing about the last few weeks made sense. The king studied her carefully. "Are you unhappy at the palace?" "No." "Do you wish to leave?" She answered immediately. "No." Relief flickered across his face before he could hide it. The reaction surprised both of them. Silence returned. Then the king stepped closer to the fountain and rested one hand against the cool stone edge. Moonlight reflected in the water beside him. "Do you know why I kept returning to the kitchen?" he asked. Lyra shook her head. "At first I thought it was the food." His gaze drifted toward the dark sky above them. "The meals reminded me of simpler days. Days before responsibility became the center of my life." His voice grew quieter. "Then I realized the food was only part of it." Lyra's heart began to beat faster. "When I was young," he continued, "my mother believed every meal should make people feel welcome. She used to say that kindness leaves a mark long after words are forgotten." He smiled faintly at the memory. "I had not felt that kind of warmth in years." The garden seemed impossibly still. "Then I met you." Lyra looked up. The honesty in his eyes left no room for misunderstanding. "Every time I walked into that kitchen, the noise in my head grew quieter. Every conversation felt easier. Every burden felt lighter." He laughed softly. "It took me far longer than it should have to understand why." Emotion tightened her throat. For years, she had hidden herself from the world. Hidden her scent. Hidden her feelings. hidden her existence. Yet somehow this man had noticed everything that mattered. "I am only a cook," she whispered. The king looked genuinely puzzled. "Only," he gestured toward the manor behind them. "Half the people inside that building spend their lives trying to impress others." Then he looked directly at her. "You spend yours helping them." The words settled deep inside her heart. For the first time in years, Lyra felt seen without feeling exposed, valued without being judged. The fountain water shimmered beside them. The breeze carried the scent of roses through the night air. Then something unusual happened. A faint silver glow appeared around them. Soft, gentle, beautiful. Guests watching from distant windows gasped. The king noticed it at the same moment Lyra did. Neither moved, neither spoke, because deep inside, both of them understood exactly what the ancient light meant. The silver light lingered only a few seconds before fading into the night, but it was enough. Every guest who witnessed it understood what they had seen. Ancient bonds were rare. Stories were written about them. Songs survived for generations because of them. Yet none of those people mattered to Lyra in that moment. She could only see the man standing beside the fountain. The man who had noticed her when no one else had. The man who had tasted a simple bowl of soup and somehow discovered the loneliness hidden beneath years of silence. The weeks that followed changed the kingdom, not through proclamations or grand ceremonies at first, but through whispers. Courtiers talked, merchants talked, servants talked. The story spread from village to village until even distant farms knew the tale of the palace cook who had captured the king's heart. Some people expected Lyra to change. They expected expensive gowns, endless attention, and a life far removed from the kitchen. Instead, she continued waking before sunrise. She continued checking fresh produce deliveries. She continued teaching younger cooks how to prepare meals with patience and care. The only difference was that now people greeted her with respect instead of indifference. Several months later, Silverfong Palace hosted a celebration unlike any in recent memory. Banners hung from every tower. Lanterns illuminated every courtyard. Families traveled hundreds of miles to witness the event. The grand hall overflowed with nobles, merchants, soldiers, and servants standing side by side beneath golden chandeliers. Lyra stood near the throne platform, wearing a simple silver dress chosen by the palace seamstresses. She felt nervous, overwhelmed, certain she did not belong in such a place. Then she looked across the hall and saw familiar faces from the kitchen. The head chef smiled proudly. Young servants waved when they thought no one was looking. Suddenly the room felt less frightening. The Alpha King stepped forward and the hall fell silent. For a moment he said nothing. His silver eyes swept across the crowd before finally settling on Lyra. A smile touched his face. Genuine, warm, rare. "Many people have asked me the same question," he began. "Why her?" A few guests laughed softly. The king looked toward Lyra. "Some expected me to choose based on status. Others expected power. Others expected beauty." His voice remained calm. "They were all wrong." The room grew still. "I chose the person who reminded me what kindness feels like." Emotion tightened Lyra's throat. The king continued. "The person who gave comfort without asking for recognition. The person who helped others long before anyone noticed her." He extended his hand. "The person who taught me that home is not a place. It is a feeling." Tears filled Lyra's eyes as she stepped forward. The hall erupted into applause. Not because she had become important. Not because she stood beside a king. Because everyone could see the truth. She had never changed. She had always been extraordinary. Years later, visitors to Silverfong Palace would still find one small kitchen in the western wing filled with the scent of fresh bread, apples, rosemary, and cinnamon. Children from nearby villages often visited for meals. Traveling workers were welcomed during difficult winters. And sometimes, late in the evening, the king himself could be found sitting quietly at a wooden table while Lyra prepared dinner nearby. Whenever someone asked how their story began, he always gave the same answer. Not with a battle, not with a royal decree, not with destiny. It began with a meal prepared by someone who placed love into every ingredient, and a lonely man who finally recognized its taste.